Good evening. Welcome to a Clear Mountain Wednesday live stream. Today we're joined by Luang Punnadhammo, one of our teachers and mentors. Thank you so much, Luang.
Okay.
So Luang, usually we'd introduce our guests, but we wanted to actually try having you introduce yourself a little bit. We were hoping to speak about Abhidhamma today. Would you be able to kind of briefly take us from, give us your biography in the sense of your path from layman to abbot who is interested in Abhidhamma or who has studied Abhidhamma?
Okay. I ordained it in Thailand when I was 35. But before that, for 10 years before that, I was serious practitioner, studier, and meditator of Buddhism. And I'd been interested in Buddhism since the late 70s. So I'm 70 years old now, so I spent half of my life in robes. The first 5 years of my bhikkhu life I spent in Thailand. Then I returned to Canada, and I took charge of the Arrow River Center. At that time, that's actually where I started, under the tutelage of a teacher, Kema Ananda. He was my teacher back in the 80s, and then I took over here when he died in 1996, and I've been here ever since.
And just following up on that, how did you become interested in Abhidhamma, and what is Abhidhamma, and what is the Dhamma? What are Dhammas in Abhidhamma? So 3 related questions.
Okay. How I became interested in Abhidhamma, I think probably my first exposure to it was reading the Visuddhimagga, and that raised more questions than about details. So I went on to study further, and it's always appealed to me as a kind of intellectual exercise, digging into Abhidhamma. Abhidhamma is the third Pitaka. It's part of the canon, and it's very technical. It's quite different than the Sutta Pitaka. There are no stories. There's no kind of colorful, bits. It's dry technical enumeration of mental states and so on. No, I don't know if you want to get into like the history of Abhidhamma and how it originated and so on.
Yeah, I think that could be interesting. And I do your elaboration and Karuna Dasa's elaboration of what a Dhamma is as a point.
Yes.
It's rather fascinating.
Yes. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll do just a very brief summary of the provenance of Abhidhamma. The traditional story is that the Buddha spent one rainy season in Tawatingsa heaven, and he taught the gods in Tawatingsa. And every day he'd come back to earth for his alms round and meal, and he'd give the summary of what he taught to the Devas to Sariputta, who then developed it into the Abhidhamma. So the import of that story is to impress the importance and high level of the Abhidhamma, and the idea is that what we have here is kind of the dumbed down version of what the Buddha taught the Devas. It's a colorful story, but I think it doesn't really bear out historically, because we have some at least partial Abhidhammas from the other 18 original schools, and they're quite different in structure and in details, whereas the Sutta Pitaka generally agrees. So, my feeling of the Abhidhamma is that it probably served for each school as a kind of a manifesto. It was the way the school said, okay, this is how we understand the dubious points and the unclear things. This is how we understand it. And so the Abhidhamma of the Theravada is what we have in Pali, and it's also a I would say a living tradition, that it's always, there are 7 canonical Abhidhamma books, but then there's commentaries and sub-commentaries, and people are writing on Abhidhamma down to the present day, and it's difficult without study to determine what details are original and which are later. But you bring up the question of dhammas.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably not understood in the sense that we understand it now in the original Abhidhamma. It was developed in the commentaries. It's a kind of atomic theory of mind and matter, that everything can be reduced to these momentary points. The Buddhist scholar, Russian Buddhist scholar from the early 20th century, Sherbatsky, he came up with I think is a very brilliant phrase, point instant, point dash instant, because a point in mathematics is a location without any extension, and a moment is a point in time without any duration. Okay? So this was actually, and you'll see that in Karuna Das's book discussed in detail. There was actually controversies in early Buddhism. This is one of the controverted points, whether a Dhamma actually has any duration. The Theravada position was that it does have a very infinitesimally brief duration. It actually exists for a moment. But other schools of Buddhism said, no, that's just an illusion of the mind. It's only an instant without any duration at all. So it gets very abstract and very technical in these kind of details.
You bring up that quality, the abstract nature. I have heard someone say, the Buddha was teaching people how to bake a pie, and the Abhidhamma is like the periodic table. It's very precise. There's 89 types of citta. There's 52 cetasika, mental constituents. And the recent EBT movement, early Buddhist text movement, sort of trying to trace back to the Buddha's words, has to a large extent, I think, dismissed the usefulness of the Abhidhamma.
Yeah.
And honestly, what I found so refreshing about your teachings, Luangpo, is you honor the tradition and these teachings as meaningful and relevant. So I'm curious, there's a lot of questions, but first, why should people study the Abhidhamma? Why isn't it just a bunch of abstract thought tagged on in the centuries after the Buddha?
Well, it's very useful for understanding the way the mind works. And you'll see, for example, in Burma, which is the heartland of Vipassana practice, they also take a great interest in Abhidhamma. So Vipassana is like the experience of examining the mind, and Abhidhamma is the theory. So the two go hand in hand really, really well together. So a study of Abhidhamma, I think it takes a lot of the vagueness out of our understanding of Buddhist teachings. It really brings things down to a real precise point.
I've heard them say, when Buddhism left India, the suttas floated to Sri Lanka, the Vinaya floated to Thailand, and the Abhidhamma floated to Burma. And yes. I remember meeting a Burmese monk, and he was like, if you haven't studied the Abhidhamma, you don't know Buddhism. And I was like, what's the Abhidhamma? and after I was like, oh, it's the Abhidhamma.
Yeah.
Well, one really somewhat central or certainly interesting aspect of Abhidhammic thought is this concept of bhavanga, which I think I've heard you refer to as like the idling of a car, similar to the idling of a car. Like, maybe similar to the function of the default mode. It's like this, what the mind adverts to when it's not doing anything else. And I'm
Yes.
curious if you could talk more about this bhavanga state, and is it just totally inversely correlate to sati? So when there is mindfulness, there's not, the mind isn't associated with bhavanga? And if so, what is an arahant's relationship with bhavanga? Does an arahant still experience bhavanga?
No, that's a good question. I'm not sure about the arahant. I would speculate from what I understand about the theory of the arahant's mind is given in Abhidhamma that they would have some experience of bhavanga, but it would be much less than an ordinary person. Certainly, arahant sleeps, and when you're in deep sleep, it's continuous bhavanga. Bhavanga is like the ground level of consciousness. And one of the kind of oddities of the theory that I've never really come to terms with 100% is the idea that when you die, your last moment of consciousness, the object that you take, becomes your bhavanga object for your subsequent birth. So every moment in your future life will revert to that object. So it sets the character of the being to some degree, and it's unchanging for one lifetime. I think that's a very late idea that's found in the Visuddhimagga. But the idea of the bhavanga is when the mind is not really doing anything. So when you're in deep sleep, it's continuous bhavanga. But when you're in your daily life, waking life, you keep reverting back to bhavanga. And if you're someone who's or at a time when anybody is dull and not very aware, so it is the inverse of having sati. You're spending a lot of time in bhavanga, and the mind is then, when an object impinges on the mind, the bhavanga is disturbed, and the mind goes out to take that object. So if you have good mindfulness, you're not reverting back to bhavanga all the time. You're continually taking objects.
Just a little bit of a follow-up of that. I've heard a Thai Kruba Ajahn, a Thai teacher, say that basically for an arahant, like their mindfulness is full, like they always have mindfulness. And I'm curious if the Abhidhamma has any reference to that while they're awake, at least, they don't fall into this bhavanga, or, I mean, it would certainly be the case that they never kind of fall into kind of the akusala cetasika, the unwholesome mind state. But
bhavanga is not classified as akusala.
Right.
It's neutral. I like I said, I don't know for certain what the mind stream of an arahant, whether they experience bhavanga in the waking state at all. It's possible they don't. But there may be moments in between adverting to an object that the mind would experience bhavanga.
Right.
So I can't give a definitive answer to that question.
Okay.
One interesting thing. So there are 4 universals in Abhidhamma, basically dividing up the pie of reality into, we have citta. So this isn't, I mean, all this Luangpur. Citta, cetasika, which is mental constituents, and citta is sort of consciousness. Cetasika, mental constituents, rupa, form, and then nibbana. And one thing it'd be interesting to get into all of those, but to begin with, cetasika I find to be very interesting. And these are mental constituents. There's 52 in total. You have sanya, you have vedana, and then the other 50 are all different kinds of sankhara, or formations.
Yes.
And what's so interesting about that system is there are a huge number of wholesome universal cetasika. So qualities that manifest in the always with a wholesome mind state. 19. And then there's only 4 universal negative akusala cetasika, non-conscientiousness, non-concern, ignorance, moha, delusion, and restlessness. How do you make sense? I mean, there's a lot to go in there, but first of all, how do you make sense of that imbalance? Like, what lesson do you take from the fact that there's so many more, the color or spectrum of wholesome is so much wider and vaster than these 4 unwholesome universals? 19 versus 4 is quite an imbalance.
Yeah, I think that in the tenor of the teachings in general is that the mind is naturally good. Like you see them, for example, when also in the Sutta Pitaka as well as the Abhidhamma, that very often the wholesome states are just given as negatives of the unwholesome, like adosa, amoha, alopa, because when you don't have to say, like, the opposite of aloba would be renunciation, right? But you don't have to say that, because if lopa's desire or greed is not present, the mind is naturally liberated from that. It goes to its natural state, which is the renunciant state. So it's the fact that there are only these 4 akusala universals, unskillful universals, is because the bad side, or the unskillful side, is crude, it's simple, right? But the kusala, the good side, is flourishing.
Please. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I mean, just thinking about the spectrum of those wholesome states, the rainbow of those 19, I've always wondered about that. So those 19 include faith, mindfulness, conscience, concern, non-greed, non-anger, equanimity, say tranquility of mental body and mind, lightness, adaptability, softness, and a few others, and a few more, a bunch. So
these memorized quite well.
Yeah. Ajahn Nisabho was telling me to go faster, speed it up. Come on. But yeah, the fact that all of those exist at the same time is rather fascinating. And so if one has a moment of faith come up, like one's bowing or one's using like a mantra of Buddha, and one really is having faith in that moment, what are the implications of that? Or if there's mindfulness, that there is an aspect, if you advert to it, if you look for it, that faith is present there, or that bodily or mental tranquility is there. What are those implications?
Well, they're all aspects or qualities that go together in the wholesome mind. In a sense, they're not discrete. They're not discrete objects or states. They're qualities that color the mind at that moment. And like that, this is a characteristic of Abhidhamma, is perhaps a way of looking at things that, and this is where people criticize Abhidhamma approach sometimes, is that it's too sort of cut and dried and technical, right? Whereas the actual lived experience is more fluid. But this is a way of trying to express that in technical language, that there is this whole unfolding of the mind at that moment with all these qualities.
A related question: the last 12 of those 19 are 6 pairs.
Yeah.
And it's kaya, related to what's translated as the mind body.
Yeah.
And then the citta of like tranquility or softness or lightness. What is the mind body referring there?
I think that's the cetasikhas. They're the 3 three aggregates of perception, sankharas, and vedana.
Okay, interesting.
That's the mental body. Yeah. The word kaya in Pali, sometimes it just means the body, like the physical body, but it has a more general sense, just meaning a body as a unit or a grouping. Like we use that in English, the word, you might say the body of the teachings. Or
I find you're speaking about that flourishing aspect of the liberating mind or the wholesome mind is it's a beautiful, that versus the crudeness of just four qualities of the unwholesome is such a beautiful way of talking about it. And one of the things that I found very a very practical way of using the Abhidhamma teachings for me, one thing is seeing that those four unwholesome universals, one of them is restlessness. And the idea being that if you undercut one of those, the whole unwholesome mind state has to fall apart. So if you can just get rid of restlessness and like ground in your body or get the energy circulating or something, then one of the universals is gone. So the whole unwholesome state falls. Do you have any other kind of really practical applications you found for these cetasikhas or like interesting little gems or insights that have kind of popped up?
Well, one that comes to mind immediately is one of the features or really interesting kind of rabbit holes in Abhidhamma is, in any book in Abhidhamma you'll see these charts, cross-referencing different things, and if you cross-reference the chittas, the wholesome and unwholesome chittas, with the vedana, with feeling, right? There's, for unpleasant feeling, domanassa, vedana, only occurs with unskillful mind states.
An unpleasant mental feeling.
Yeah. So that means, if there's never any skillful or good reason to feel sad or down, right? You're always being unskillful.
Another insight I've heard you talk about is greed ditthi arises always with lobha or greed, but dosa never arises with ditthi or views. Is that, am I getting that right?
Like that? Yeah, I think so. I'd have to check that, but I think that does sound right.
Okay. I didn't know if there's an insight hidden in there as well around, but it's okay. The other one you gave me is plenty, Longpor.
Yeah.
Do you got one?
Well, just on that theme of the domanassa, or this depressive, downhearted mind, the down heart, literally. How does one actually work with that? Like, I mean, if one is like, clinically depressed, it just seems like it would be more depressing to realize that depression, according to Abhidhamma, is inherent.
Yeah, I agree. You have to be careful in giving that teaching, because some people take it the wrong way. They feel guilty for being sad. Which is not itself is an unskillful reaction.
Yeah.
I think there's different levels of this. If we're talking about just ordinary grief or sadness, to first of all just be mindful that this is present in the mind, and to accept that we're human beings, we're not perfect, we're gonna, but if you understand that teaching, then you don't see it as valuable, right? You don't cherish it. Some people like to wallow in their sadness. You realize that is always associated with some long-term depression. I think that from experience, it seems like the best way to deal with it is to get out of yourself and be active, and particularly in service of others. Because depression is actually, and this is another thing people may not want to hear, but depression is actually an extremely selfish mind state, right? you're obsessed with yourself. Oh, poor me, right?
Mm.
And it becomes, and it's a real suffering. So it seems, I don't think you can really meditate your way out of it.
Mm.
You need to have, you need to get the person active and doing something physical.
Mm.
And particularly if it's in service of others as an extra bonus, it helps.
You've highlighted something which I feel like is also a gem, which is not so apparent if you just see the list or see the table, is that piti, or rapture, or even just joy, is like a karmic multiplier. And I'm
Yes.
curious if you could talk about that. Is that due to its presence as a undefined cetasika?
Well, first of all, the idea of karma is action is always made by the mind, and something that's not deliberate or intentional has no karma. The classic example is stepping on an insect in the dark. You're not making any karma. The physical action is only a result and an expression of the mind state. The karma is actually made in the mind. So there's a sense, a way of looking at karma as a kind of a counting, a balancing. For an unskillful mind state, you get an unpleasant result, vice versa, right? And the Vedana associated with the mind moment has an effect on the intensity of the karma. And any act done with a mind of joy, because joy is an energizing factor, it increases the intensity of the mind moment, then it is more powerful for good or for ill. And if you do an act of generosity, you give a gift, and you just do it kind of mechanically without any consideration, that's still good karma, but it's weaker than if you do it with a full heart of joy and happiness. It's the same in the opposite direction with evil deeds. If you hurt someone, but you do it cold-heartedly, that's not as bad as if you relish it. You take joy in inflicting pain, then that's a worse karma. And another one that's at first seems counterintuitive to people, but when you think about it, it does make sense, is the effect of views, ditthi, on karma. Having wrong intensifies bad karma. Someone might do something, sacrifice, right? Someone, in the Buddha time, the Brahmanical priests who sacrifice goats or whatever, they think they're doing a meritorious deed, pleasing the gods. But that's actually worse karma for them than if someone who just kills a goat for the meat or to get rid of it or whatever.
It's interesting. I just remember reading a few weeks ago a passage from the Questions for King Milinda, a sort of another paracanonical or canonical text, and King Milinda asks the monk Nagasena if good karma or negative karma is more powerful, or good action or bad action, and Nagasena says good action, because when you do something good, you take joy in it, whereas with bad action, you have remorse, and so the good action's more potentized. But that only applies if you have right view, as you said. Like if someone has wrong view, they can really delight in negative action. That's
yes, yeah.
Luang, I'm curious, with the Abhidhamma's kind of systemization, you can feel it kind of beginning to hit an asymptote when it, or kind of a realm that it can't quite wade into when it begins to talk about arahants.
Yes.
For example, it tries to classify the moral chittas when arahants are embodying them because they don't produce karma. They're just functional chittas, which I don't understand at all. And then there's even this very interesting chitta. I think it's called like the arahant smile chitta.
Yes. Yeah.
And I've always found that fascinating because there are these interesting instances in the suttas where Mahamoggallana will smile at something, maybe not all that happy, like a ghost and suffering,
Yes.
or the Buddha will smile. So
Yes.
what would you say about that particular citta, and any comment on the whole situation where the Abhidhamma begins to try to speak about what maybe it can't actually speak about?
Mm. Yeah, I know exactly, what you're saying about, and this refers back to your question about whether an arahant is bhavanga. When we're speculating about the mind states of an arahant or a Buddha, it becomes, a bit kind of lost. This smile producing citta, that's an interesting case. As I believe it originates in the suttas, or the need for it originates in the sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya. There's a series of sutta where Moggallana sees various kinds of petas, ghosts, skeletons, and bloody corpses and things, and he smiles. And his companion says, "What are you smiling at?" And he says, "Well, I saw this ghost." And the commentary has a difficult time explaining, why is Moggallana smiling? And the answer that the commentary comes up with is not very satisfying either. It says he smiles because he realizes that he has got to the point where he'll never be born in such a horrible state, which doesn't seem very, very, very laudatory. and I think when the Abhidhamma came to be formalized, this was their kind of way of putting that oddity into a pigeonhole. Like, okay, there's this one particular citta that only occurs in an arhat when he sees something unpleasant. It's an explanation that's a non-explanation.
Thank you.
Just on the edges, so moving from those four paramatta, these four paramatta dhammas, to something which is called conditional relations. And everybody should watch all of you have 9 videos, a whole playlist on different aspects of Abhidhamma. And the last one there is on conditional relations.
Yes.
Paccaya of the Patana, the 7th book of the Abhidhamma. And basically what we chant, part of what we chant for funerals, the Hetu Paccayo, Aramana Paccayo, Adipati Paccayo, and there are 24 of these. And honestly, I had no idea what I was chanting, really, until just this week. And I'm curious but now I find it rather fascinating, these different ways that conditionality works. And I'd be curious if you have had any insights using those 24 Paccaya and what you feel like the function of that list is.
Yeah, it's a kind of a philosophical attempt to enumerate causality. This is always in every kind of religious and philosophical system that gets sophisticated enough. There's always one of the intellectual problems is explaining causality, and you can see it in the Greek thought too. They have different levels of causation they talk about. Some of them overlap with the Buddhist ones. The idea that you want to get away from a simplistic view of causality as being linear, one thing causes another, like a chain of dominoes. It's actually more like a network or a matrix. There's a principle: nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause. So there's multiple causes for every event or incident, every Dhamma. There's the proximate cause, which is the immediately preceding moment. Proximate cause. There's a habitual cause. There's co-nascent causality, things that arise together. Pre-nascent causality, something that's arisen in the past that will affect the future, and so on. So as you say, there's 24 of these. The book of the Patana, the whole book of Patana is huge. It's like an encyclopedia. And I don't know anyone who's really gone through it and studied it in that detail, but there's a belief in Burma that the when Buddha we're in the declining age of Buddhism, and we're going to lose all the teachings, and it'll start with the Patana. The Patana will be lost.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are monks who make a specialty of memorizing the Patana so it doesn't become lost.
Maybe just one last curiosity. I recently came across an essay called The Mystique of Abhidhamma that Bhante Sujato wrote in 2010. Have you read that before?
No, I haven't.
It's rather fascinating. I mean, he writes it in an intentionally playfully and provocative spirit. But he puts forth this theory that he calls Abhidhamma a mystical cult, and says that basically one function it serves is to create this impression of unimpeachable authority. And it basically creates this whole gatekeeper setup that, like, someone who knows the Abhidhamma, who's memorized the Patana, those are the gatekeepers. Those are the ones who, it creates this elite class. And I'm curious if you've ever thought about that, or what you think about that.
Well, I could see how that could come up. I tend to see the Abhidhamma more as I think I mentioned before, a living tradition, that it's an intellectual tradition that carries on and has different schools of thought or nuances within it. I don't see it as a kind of, I don't approach it as being some kind of unimpeachable absolute authority.
One more question before we go to the chat. So Ajahn Kovilo referenced, and you did, the citta, the death consciousness, and the Abhidhamma says that's very significant for your next rebirth. And you don't find too much indication of that in the suttas, but in kind of common folk wisdom, it's taken very seriously that, your state of mind when you die has a huge effect on your rebirth. What are your thoughts on the importance of that moment at death and where that leads one?
Yeah, that would seem to make sense to me, because the mind stream is a continuous, one after the other. And we talk about different kinds of causation. The proximate cause is a very powerful effect, and the moment of death is then followed by a re-arising somewhere else. That there's a lot of discussion, but whether or not there's an intermediate state, there's still that moment. The last moment of this life continuum is then followed immediately by either arising in an intermediate state or arising in a rebirth. So it's going to have a strong influence on what happens next.
So we have a couple questions in the chat. So the first question is Bhikkhu Bodhi's comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma the best place to get started if we want to read Abhidhamma, or are there other available English translations, or would you recommend, that is a translation of a sub-commentary.
Yes.
It's an amazing translation, but I'm curious, what would you recommend for someone just beginning to study Abhidhamma?
I would say that book by Bhikkhu Bodhi, the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma, is the really best place to start.
Okay.
And then go on to Karunadasa.
Yeah.
Theravada Abhidhamma.
Theravada Abhidhamma.
Yeah. The original Abhidhamma texts are available. They're not very approachable, and you have difficulty understanding them if you don't already have a structure to work from.
They are all pretty much available. The PTS editions of them are available in somewhat not so badly scanned PTS versions as PDFs online. And have you read the introductions to those, Luang Por, or any of them?
I have a long time ago. I don't remember.
Okay.
I don't remember it well.
I haven't read them, but I thought, I.B. Horner and these great translators, I thought maybe they have something interesting to say.
I don't think so. I don't remember. Another point about the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma, there is another translation, an older translation by a Burmese into English, but I think I can't remember his name now.
Narada, maybe.
I don't think it was Narada.
Okay.
But anyways, I think that Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation is the best.
Hmm.
And Bhikkhu Bodhi's his own commentary that he puts into that book, explaining it, is really good. He's got a really good way of explaining.
You're back, Luang. We heard that. We heard very good, and Ajahn Kovilo also chimed in with excellent. So
Okay.
Another question from the chat, Luang. Doran asks, does the Theravada Abhidhamma explain the meaning of the term Namarupa, and does it discuss the relationship to vijnana, i.e. that link in paticca samuppada or dependent origination? And for those who don't know, Namarupa is name and form, mentality, materiality, and vijnana is consciousness, and paticca samuppada is dependent origination.
Yes, okay. Namarupa in Abhidhamma terms would be Rupa and Cetasika. At least, if we're taking the Visuddhimagga, the commentaries as a guide, Namarupa in the paticca samuppada is all the aggregates except for consciousness, vijnana, which isn't separate, right? So one of the traditional images in the Tibetan wheel, they do the stages of dependent origination with images. The image for Namarupa is three men in a boat. The boat is the body, Rupa, and the three mental aggregates other than consciousness are the men in the boat. The relation between consciousness and Namarupa is that the consciousness arises at the first instant. The consciousness in the vijnana in the paticca samuppada is glossed even in the sutta itself as patisandhi vijnana, rebirth linking consciousness. So it's consciousness arising in a new continuum, and it's that consciousness arising that allows the unfolding of name and form, of body and mind. There's a whole, there's a lot could be said about that. It's like the arising of in the case of a human or animal birth, the embryo starts out, undifferentiated cell, and then multiplies as under a few multiplications. Then it begins scientific level completely, how be a nerve cell or a bone cell or whatever, and a very complex process. And it's you should look into the writings of Rupert Sheldrake. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah.
And talk about morphogenetic fields. That's like the role of vijnana in the unfolding of an embryo. It's like the information. There's a whole kind of train of thought now that the fundamental reality of the universe is information. Some kind of science-minded people talk that way. That information is the most fundamental quality, and all matter and everything else unfolds from following the guiding of information, which is kind of like saying mind. Mind is the forerunner. First verse of Dhammapada.
Yeah. Lumpur, I'm curious, having brought science into the picture, I mean, of those four absolutes of mind objects, form, and nibbana, the mind objects I find the most fascinating, then consciousness, in terms of the ways they're described in Abhidhamma. But this whole aspect of form and like this idea of kalapas, which is kind of like a Abhidhammic atom, which has parts which are always present in a form molecule, these kalapas, which are earth, fire, wind, water, and then plus 4 others, which include taste.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how much or how little resonance is there between the Abhidhammic idea of atomic theory in science versus modern science?
Well, first of all, I'll say that the whole scheme of kalapas is a very late addition to the Abhidhamma corpus. It's certainly not original. It's like from the initial idea of things being composed of dhammas, and they elaborate it and look in further and examine, how it works, and they come up with these the subcomponents, and it is sort of, it's not identical to, but it's parallel to, in a lot of ways, to modern atomic theory. Like even in modern, it's just kind of a bit of coincidental maybe, but in modern subatomic theory, they talk about different quarks and they give them names: up, down, strange, and charming, or something. And the names are just sort of arbitrarily.
I believe I've heard also that you said the approximate length of a kalapa in the Abhidhamma is about the length of a hydrogen atom, more or less. So
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably the Burmese mind once they started getting knowledge of modern science. They try to quantify things. I think that's a very, very late development in quantifying the size and duration of dhammas and kalapas.
Lumpur, we have one more question for you, and then we will pay respects and let you rest.
Okay.
Nelson asks, how do you see the values of commentary literature in the Mahayana, such as the Yogacara Bhumi?
Well, they're all they're all different approaches trying to understand the underlying reality. That some of those Mahayana thinkers like Nagarjuna are really, really worthwhile to read and to study. They have something valuable to say. But just like I'm unable to take literally the story of the Buddha bringing the Abhidhamma down from Tawatingsa. I don't believe that the Mahayana suttas were hidden in the Naga realm until humans were ready to receive them. There is an interesting academic essay. I want to put this out there that I read recently. I can't remember the title of it, but somebody sent it to me. It's by a Buddhist professor who came up with the idea that both the Mahayana as the whole tradition, a school, and the Abhidhamma in the form that we have it, they arose around the same time, in the early years AD. And he thinks that both of them, for different reasons, became possible when literacy became common in India. That in the case of the Mahayana, you couldn't introduce new teachings very well when all the transmission was by chanting together in groups. Someone can't just show up and start chanting the Lotus Sutra. What's this guy talking about? But when you can write it out as a manuscript and pass it around, people can read it, and if they like it, they'll copy it and pass it around more. It's just one-to-one. The Abhidhamma is a little different. I mentioned before how you'll see in Abhidhamma books always these charts cross-referencing things. It's not really possible to approach Abhidhamma in a mature form in a purely oral tradition, because you're unable to do these cross-references. And it takes a two-dimensional, at least, or in some cases 3 or 4 dimensions of comparison. So you have to be able to lay things out in a visual way and cross-reference things to really grasp them.
Luang, thank you for defending the Abhidhamma today and for joining us. And just your teachings and guidance have been very appreciated these last years. We tune in often, and if you're ever near Seattle, please consider coming and visiting us.
Okay, yeah, I would love to. Okay, thank you.
And for those who want, we'll be joining Zoom as we usually do. So we just pasted a link in the chat. If you don't see it there, you can go to clearmountainmonastery.org and find the link on the Wednesday event listing. And we'll see all of you over there in a few moments. And Luang, we'll see you hopefully in not too long.
Okay, good.
Maskan, Luang.
Okay.